All right, so let's get into some nutrition stuff, since that's what you're the go-to guy for, even though you know lots of other stuff as well. So, you know, I've been on a keto-style diet. We talked a little bit on the podcast about it, and I think that you're misinterpreted a lot of times. I think maybe because somebody puts up, you know, a post about sugar, and then you defend it, and then they think you're a fan of sugar,
Exactly.
and then they think you're only a proponent of flexible dieting, and you're only a fan of this, you're only a fan of that. How can we clear some of this up? How can we clear the air on some of these things?
Well, I think part of the problem is just people's own bias that they're going to hear what they want to hear, right? So, and I had this exact situation on Twitter. I put up a study that showed that ketogenic diet did not have any more beneficial fat loss effects versus a traditional diet when protein was equated. Protein and calories were the same.
Right.
So that's what I said, and somebody responded to me and said, "Well, that's not true. I lost 50 pounds on the ketogenic diet." I said, "I didn't say it didn't work. I said it just wasn't better." And this person fought with me for like, I don't know, probably back and forth for like a dozen messages. I said, you don't understand. I'm not saying it doesn't work. And so it was just crazy for me to say it's not better than a regular diet, and somebody to hear, Lane says the ketogenic diet doesn't work, right? Same thing with intermittent fasting. I've had the same deal. You know, any kind of thing. And what I'll tell people is like, listen, if you like a ketogenic diet, at the end of the day, the best diet is the one that you can be adherent to, right? That you can stick to.
One that you can follow, yeah.
Right, so I find for a lot of people, it's very hard for them to stick to a ketogenic diet because, I mean, you're just not going to eat carbs, right? And their carbs are everywhere. Right. So for me, I find that most times what works best for a lot of people is teaching them portion control, teaching them how to track this and that.
Eventually, you're going to have to learn how to eat less. If you gained a lot of weight and you're 250 pounds and you want to lose weight, you're going to have to eventually teach yourself to do something different than what you were doing before, and you'll have to figure out a way to expend more energy than you're taking in.
Right, and at the end of the day, a ketogenic diet works only because you're creating a calorie deficit.
Right.
If you're losing fat, it's only because you're creating a calorie deficit because you're cutting out a whole food group.
Right.
But if you eat enough fat and protein, you can gain weight. There's no doubt about it. So
one of the CrossFit guys who's here today said he gained 35 pounds on a ketogenic diet.
Sure, I mean, if you're just...
He intentionally he wanted to gain weight.
To see if it could.
He got rid of carbohydrates, and he had, you know, some allergies and stuff to some certain foods. He didn't even know it.
Right.
And so he responded really well to the diet.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, and that's one thing I'll say, you know, when I say flexible dieting, I don't mean Pop-Tarts and this sort of thing.
Right.
What I mean is using a diet that you feel minimally restricted on, right? And something, and just being mindful of what you're eating, right? I think a lot of people are looking for the magic bullet of, what are the foods that I can eat as much as I want of, and I'm not going to gain weight, so I don't have to worry about it. And I'm sorry, it just doesn't exist. You know,
what do you think some of the best information on flexible dieting is? Because when you scroll around on the internet, you know, there's a lot of different information on it, and then people see the Pop-Tarts and they see the ice cream and stuff, and they get a weird interpretation of it.
Right. You know, and I think part of that is too, nobody wants to show the boring foods they're eating. We want to show, and you know, I'm guilty of this too.
Chicken breast, no,
I'm going to put up a picture of me eating an ice cream sandwich every day and me being ripped, and you know, it's going to create a reaction, you know, because at the end of the day, we're
trying to be entertaining in some ways.
It's not false. It's not false. Now, I do try to keep it in line, and I put up some bro foods every once in a while. But I think, you know, some of the best people to follow, you know, Alan Oregon, he's very good with regards to his information on flexible dieting. You know, my website's Avatar Nutrition, as well as biolane.com. We have a lot of information about flexible dieting on there.
Some of the articles you've written for bodybuilding.com, do they contain some information on flexible dieting?
Yeah, I've got some stuff on there, you know, and again, I've had people, and if you tell me I like a ketogenic diet, I feel good on it, I can adhere to it, awesome. You know, I had this with fasted cardio because, you know, the research shows that fasted cardio does not cause more fat loss than eating beforehand. Okay, so
just to clear it up, by waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and doing a fasted cardio session,
it's not any better than if you ate before.
It doesn't really make a difference.
It doesn't make a difference. Now, if you're somebody who you have to work early in the morning and you get up and that's the only time you can do your cardio, and you don't like eating before that, fine.
Sounds like
fine.
A good way to do it. Yeah.
Right, that's fine, right? It's all about, you know, what can fit your lifestyle, what you can accommodate. But if you're trying to tell me that there's magic there, I'm going to put my foot down and say no. But it's funny, somebody said, yeah, I heard you hate fasted cardio. I said, well, I don't hate fasted cardio. It didn't come in my house and, you know, kick my dog and punch my wife, you know, like I don't hate it. I just, you know, I think if you're telling me it's better, that it's not correct.
There's no research to back it up.
And so I'm not anti really anything. I'm anti bullshit if
Right.
that's it. And so, you know, I think when you've gone, I think the scientists tend to think a little bit differently. And I think the main thing about a scientist is they're always skeptical, right? So we can have an idea about stuff, and if we look at something, it sounds correct. You know, sugar should cause more fat gain and whatnot. But no matter how correct something sounds, a scientist will always look at it and go, I wonder if that's bullshit, right? And so that's why we have to actually do the studies, because fasted cardio, it sounds good, right? It sounds like, okay, you're fasted. If you do this cardio, you're going to burn more fat from your stored body fat. I mean, it sounds like that would
like
be
a nice
right,
plan, yeah.
right? But when you actually test it, what you find is sometimes things don't always work out like you thought. That's why we call them hypotheses, and we actually have to test them. So in the case of fasted cardio, what you find is, yes, you do burn a greater percentage of calories from body fat. But what happens is your thermogenic response is lower. The overall amount of calories you burn is lower. Whereas you eat beforehand, you burn less of the total percentage of calories from fat, but the overall amount you burn from fat is still the same.
Right.
So again, it's one of those things where when you test it, it just doesn't hold up to the litmus test of science.
What is a ketone exactly?
So a ketone is a byproduct of fat metabolism. So where once you've been either fasting or low carbohydrate for enough period of time, I don't want to get too much into the biochemistry of it because I'll lose 99% of our audience, but essentially what happens is because fats go through what's called beta oxidation, so you're lopping off 2 carbon units of fat, fatty acids, and those 2 carbon units enter the Krebs cycle as acetyl-CoA, and that acetyl-CoA in the liver can be converted to a series of reactions to ketones, okay? Right. And the reason you form ketones is to prevent you basically from crashing your blood glucose, okay?
Gotcha.
Because if you were very low carb and you couldn't spare that blood glucose, especially when you're exercising,
right.
You can go into, I mean, theoretically, you go into hypoglycemic shock.
Does a normal body under normal circumstances, you know, doing strenuous exercise, does a normal person produce ketones occasionally?
Not really. It's a very, very low amount that you're producing. There probably are some, but it's a very, very minuscule amount.
My understanding, it's like a thing in your body to protect a little bit against something like starvation.
Right. Well,
Like you go long periods of time without food.
Right. So what you find is that one, ketones in terms of an evolutionary protective mechanism, they are muscle sparing because you can use them as energy as opposed to having to draw glucose from protein, because protein is gluconeogenic, which means you can form about 60% of amino acids can be converted to glucose. Now, people misinterpret that as to more muscle protective than, say, a comparative amount of carbohydrate, which is not true, but they are muscle sparing absolutely, if that makes sense.
So ketones are an energy source, and they've been deemed, for some people that are proponents of ketogenic diets, they've talked about it being like a 4th macronutrient. Does that sound about correct?
So you know, they can be used by, you know, basically, once you're keto adapted, now your brain can use ketones instead of glucose. And I don't consider myself a ketogenic expert by any stretch of the imagination, but my friend Dominic D'Agostino, professor at USF, we've talked a lot about it. And that's, you know, basically you're providing another source of fuel, right? And so when we look at things like Alzheimer's, which seems to be related to glucose intolerance in the brain, so you're basically not able to get glucose into brain cells, and it causes some of these problems, at least we think. So by providing a different substrate, ketones, it seems to not protect, but it seems to alleviate some of those negative effects, because you're just providing that alternate energy source. And so what's interesting is people message me all the time about the new ketone supplements that are out there, and they say, Lane, these got to be BS, this and that. And there actually seems to be some science behind them. They will actually raise blood ketone levels when you take them orally.
Right.
So, you know, if you're just
potentially could be an energy source.
Right, exactly. Now, again, it would have calories. It would be something you have to account for, you know, but I think for endurance performance, that may be something that would be helpful. For something like powerlifting, bodybuilding, I don't know how helpful it would actually be. But I mean, I think, you know, again, like I think the ketogenic diet, there's wonderful applications for it in terms of anti-cancer, anti-epilepsy, Navy SEAL divers who are under, they have a high divers have a high incidence of seizure at a really deep depths. So that's
some
actually,
people just have trouble with sugar. Like some people, they start out their lives as a fat kid that loves to eat sweets, like myself. And it just seems to me like I can be dedicated enough to do bodybuilding style diet. I've done it before, but it's just really hard for me. And I don't like eating low fat, and so something has to be low when you're trying to stay lean, right?
Sure.
Something's got to be.
Alberto Nunez.
Yeah, something has to be low or lowered, right, for you to stay lean. And so for me, that's why I kind of chose a ketogenic style diet. It's just because for me, it's what I can do in a caloric deficit.
Absolutely.
You know, I have a hard time doing anything different. We talked a little bit about fasting, just fasting, period. And I think something that needs to be cleared up, again, because people, they jump to all these crazy conclusions. There's nothing special about a ketone necessarily, correct?
Other than it's just an alternative energy source that spares glucose.
It's just like, it's not really much different than, and molecularly and everything else, I'm sure it is, but it's relatively the same to fat and protein.
More so fat.
And, you know, I think that people, they think that there's these magic components to these diets. They think a magic component to flexible dieting is somehow going to maybe enhance your growth hormone and testosterone levels to a point where you're just going to be burning fat.
Yeah.
Or they think that's true of a ketogenic style diet or whatever fad diet comes out next that people get excited about. And the truth is there's no magic to it. Right. Certain things serve a certain purpose. So in the case of being fasted, what works for me is to fast about 12 hours because being a bigger guy, it's easier for me to break my calories up into larger portion meals, and that tends to work really well for me. So that's kind of the case with fasting, is that there's not really any magic component to it. Is that correct?
I mean, there's a lot of guys who will tell you, you know, if you fast for a day, you can reset your insulin sensitivity, these sorts of things. You know, the data shows that if you're just eating a high protein, reduced calorie diet, that you get the same effects, that you're upregulating a lot of those same systems. Now, if you want to, there is some use for fasting in like cancer, like to really jumpstart getting your blood glucose down, getting ketones up. There seems to be some, you know, Dr. D'Agostino really recommends that.
Right.
But for performance, those sorts of things, you know, people think it's kind of the case of missing the forest through the trees. You know, there's a lot of people, well, if you fast, your growth hormone goes up. Let's think about this. A transient increase in growth hormone versus actually not eating anything, which do you think is more actually anabolic, you know?
Right.
And the research data actually shows that a lot of people out there probably don't even know this, that growth hormone in the physiological range is not anabolic at all. There may be some fat burning effects, but it's not anabolic. And even like the research on injectable growth hormone, I'm sure people not do, but the research on it, because I got very interested in this because just how much play growth hormone got talked about, and how
all the research I've done on it led me to believe, my own research that I've done on it leads me to believe that it should not even be classified as performance enhancing drug because it doesn't really do a ton in my experience.
It increases your connective tissue. That's what it does. Like you could make an argument that if for a person on steroids who the muscle tends to get stronger faster than the tendon,
maybe
and they're prone for injuries,
to it.
Maybe, but the side effects are so great in the studies they looked at that I have a hard time. I have a hard time saying.
Well, even something like carpal tunnel syndrome, which you may not even think is, it's like, oh, your hands hurt. It's like that's extremely painful.
Yeah.
You know.
So one of the things I always tell people is, regardless of any of this fasting, ketogenic diet, flexible dieting, fasted cardio, whatever you have, you know, everything is tools in a tool belt, you know, just like training. Now, I use my hammer a lot more than I use my power drill or my jackhammer, you know what I mean? Or my screwdriver. I use my screwdriver a lot more, but I still got my jackhammer when I need it, you know? And for some people, maybe I need...
Don't be pulling that jackhammer out right now. I gotta stand back a little bit.
That's why I got the tights on. But for some people, you know, I've had people on a ketogenic diet. I've had people do fasted cardio. You know, it just, you know, very rarely do I pull that particular tool out, but sometimes you need it. And I think that I think it's easier to sell things when you pigeonhole into one area or another, and you just make, because it's easy to develop a community, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like if I'm trying to develop a community, because it's honestly like the us versus them mentality is
People
easy
love
to
it.
sell.
Yeah, people
go,
love it. Yeah, the gang
you know,
mentality.
We're on carbs.
Yeah, people, you gotta get excited. Yeah.
But you know, whereas if I'm over here saying, you know, it's all about kind of portion control and
Right.
being modest and finding what works for you and these sort of really reasonable statements, people go, nah, I ain't got time for that shit. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I try to look
I want
at
to eat as much as I want, and
Yeah.
you know, they just think that there's going to be some magic to one of these diets, and there's just not.
Right. No, it's absolutely right. So, you know, again, when I like, for example, like, you know, the whole thing with Joe Rogan, me trying to get on Rogan about sugar, it's not me to get on there and espouse the benefits of sugar.
Right.
That's not it. It's for me to just kind of clear up some of the fear mongering that's been put out there.
Right.
And I'm not going to tell people, hey, you should eat more sugar. No. Now, maybe if you're an athlete, something like that, there actually can be applications for sugar. But very rarely, what I'm going to say is like, what happens is we create these unhealthy kind of relationships with food, and we don't think about this, but it's the truth, that if somebody thinks sugar is so bad for them, invariably when they come across some sugar, they tend to just go crazy with it because they have this idea, well, I've already blown my diet because I had that apple or whatever it was that had some sugar in it. And they tend to eat it like crazy, you know, because they can't moderate it. We call it disinhibition, and there's actually some research on this. So what I want to say is just listen, if you have a little bit of sugar, it's not that bad for you. It's fine.
Right.
Like, just make sure you're fitting it into whatever your restriction is, or if you're bulking or in a caloric surplus, fitting it into whatever your targets are for that surplus, you know. But it's, you know, trying to ascribe, you know, that it is just somehow inherently evil,
You're right.
Dr. Evil, is just wrong. You
Yeah.
know, it's just the data just doesn't support that.
Guys, this is Lane Norton, BioLane on Instagram, Avatar,
AvatarNutrition.com.
AvatarNutrition.com. His YouTube channel is probably BioLane as well.
BioLane, yep.
Anyway, Lane Norton, if you like the video, make sure you like it. Make sure you share it if you like the information we had today. Strength is never a weakness, and that's it.